Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 12th, where we're talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And A Midsummer Night's Dream makes lots of commentary about love. Some of the more specific commentaries about love in the drama include that love makes everybody an idiot. It doesn't matter what age you are, it doesn't matter what status you are, it doesn't matter what stage of relationship you happen to be in. And we see that evidenced with all of the characters who are involved in love relationships in this play. And that love can destroy friendships, as we see happening with Helena and Hermia. That love is like a magic spell, hence the idea of the love juice, that we are no longer in control when love takes over. In fact, love is like a dream. And if you think about dreams, these are things that we usually can't control. And these are things that can turn into nightmares. And these are also things that are not real. That beauty need not be tall and blonde, which would have been the conception of the time for beauty, tall and blonde. And Helena's tall and blonde, but at the beginning of the play, no one is interested in her. The people who are interested in Hermia are interested in her despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that she is short and brunette. We also see some themes that females can defy powerful figures sometimes. That's one of the great complexities with Shakespeare, is that you will see a good amount of contradiction. And I think that that contradiction really reinforces the contradiction that exists in day-to-day life. And just the title itself, A Midsummer Night's Dream, I should point out that midsummer is a pagan holiday, and it is associated with fertility. And it is one of the most sexually charged holidays of the pagan calendar. That and May Day, which is also mentioned in this play. And if you know anything about the celebration for May Day, individuals would dance around a maypole. And a maypole was supposed to be representative of a phallic symbol. So I don't know if kids know that when they're dancing around the maypole. I suspect that they don't. But both of these ideas of sexually charged days in the pagan calendar directly fly in the face of the expectations of society for virginity prior to marriage, especially for female. And a female would be considered, in effect, damaged goods. Now, we know that Shakespeare married and had his first child 7 months after their marriage. So obviously, this wasn't necessarily something that was practiced, but of course, the idea of what society promotes and then what happens behind closed doors can be two very different things. And we've seen this in other pieces of literature as well. And a little side note, the donkey or the ass, which is going to be important in terms of Bottom's transformation to a literal donkey, was considered to be the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So that's also another sexual reference. In fact, this play is filled with sexual references that usually aren't discussed in lower level classes. And the writing of the play is also complicated by the fact that not only do we have all of these multiple themes going on at the same time, but we have a mixture of poetry and prose, verse and prose, verse being poetry. And the poetry will incorporate things like rhyme or meter. You might have heard of iambic pentameter. This is a 10-syllable line of stressed and unstressed syllables. It kind of sounds like ba-boom, 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 which mimics actually the sound of a heartbeat. And many scholars have argued that that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare's rhythms seem so natural, because they mimic what is perhaps the first sound we would have ever heard, which is a mother's heartbeat when we were in the womb. And of course, Shakespeare utilizes lots of puns and lots of symbols and lots of metaphors, because ultimately he has multiplicity of levels of meaning. But what I thought I would do is just go through some of the more important pieces of each of the acts, just to make sure that you've got some clarity about some of the more important pieces in the play. And this begins basically with the first act. We had talked about that Shakespearean plays are 5 acts, and we can think of a kind of pyramid structure, with the lower left-hand side being Act 1, which is when we're introduced to characters, and then we see a rise of conflict going into Act 2, and then the height of conflict in Act 3, which would be the point of the pyramid. And then we begin to see descent in Act 4, and then resolution in Act 5. Midsummer being slightly different, because it seems as if there is resolution in Act 4 and that Act 5 is unnecessary, but trust me, Act 5 is indeed necessary. So thinking about the first act, and a couple of points that I wanted to make about Act 1. Wit. So for instance, Lysander says, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia's." And you can see in the notes below in the 3rd section, I have this quoted in parentheses, not by page number following the quote, but by act, scene, and line. And this is the standard way to reference Shakespeare, because it is universal. So it doesn't matter what edition you're using. We don't have to rely on page numbers, because the plays have all been divided into act, scene, and line. So basically you use a capital Roman numeral for the act, a lower, and then a period, and then a lowercase Roman numeral for the scene, and another period. And then you use the Arabic numbers to indicate the lines. We learn a little bit of history in the first act, and we have to, because we need a little bit of backstory. This is when Lysander says, "Demetrius made love to Neater's daughter, Helena." And basically made love, meaning that he wooed her, not that they had sexual relations, because again, it's important that these women be virginal by the ending of the play, or else they wouldn't be considered to be appropriate for marriage. So we know that ultimately Demetrius had some sort of a relationship with Helena, and he's no longer interested in Helena, which of course hurts, because Helena still is interested in him. Unrequited love is one of the many elements of love that we see in the play. What's even worse is that Demetrius has decided that he loves somebody else, and it's Helena's best friend, Hermia. So you can imagine the tensions there, especially because Helena is the tall blonde who should be getting all the attention, not her friend Hermia, who is the shorter brunette. Now, there are morals that are embedded into this play. For instance, in Act 1, Lysander at one point says, "The course of true love never did run smooth." And that is part of the justification about all of the conflicts that occur with love. One of the things that Shakespeare will show us, though, is a contrast between good rhyme and bad rhyme. And an example of good rhyme, which I have in the 3rd section below, is when Hermia is basically telling of her plan to run off with Lysander. It's a very naturalistic rhyme that forwards the plot very easily. When she says, "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell." One of the purposes for Bottom in the play, and there are multiple purposes here, but Bottom is an example of a bad actor. And he also is an example of a bad playwright. And he certainly gives us examples of bad rhyme. So when he is practicing for the play within the play that we're going to find in Act 5, Pyramus and Thisbe, one of his speeches, and this is just a few lines after the speech I quoted from Hermia, where we had naturalistic rhyme. And Bottom says, "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates." And while it rhymes, it's not a good poem. It's basically he's uttering nonsense. And at the ending of it, he even says that was lofty. In other words, he's praising himself for his fine performance, illustrating what well, for lack of a better word, ass he is, which is how it's going to be important, the transformation that occurs later on, that he's going to be physically transformed into what he is naturally, which is an ass. And when we go to the second act, we see how the conflict begins to rise. If you'll remember, in the first act, we're introduced to multiple couples, and despite their rank or their age or their stage of relationship, they're all having difficulties with love. So Theseus and Hippolyta, the king and the queen. Theseus has conquered Queen Hippolyta in war, and that means that he's won her and her peoples. The idea of power in relationships is definitely embedded within the play. And obviously she isn't too terribly happy about this, especially because she's the queen of the Amazons, because considered to be a strong warrior race. And that said, this is a comedy, so we know that by the ending of the play, they have to come to some sort of understanding. And this union wouldn't necessarily even seem unusual at the time period, a political union. And the assumption was that affection and love occurred after marriage, not necessarily before marriage. And then, of course, we're introduced to the young lovers, who basically, Hermia, Helena, Lysander, Demetrius, all have their own love problems. And you can think of King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta as engaged, and you can think of the nobles as basically dating. And Hermia and Lysander are dating and quite happy with one another, but the problem is Hermia's father does not approve of their union, and Hermia's father would rather that she be with Demetrius. In fact, he demands it. And at the time, a daughter would have been seen as property of her father. She dares to defy him. And by the ending of the play, she gets her way, which is a very interesting statement about gender in this particular drama. But at any rate, that is their conflict. And Demetrius and Lysander are fairly similar in terms of rank and in personality. So there isn't any real good justification for why the father would prefer one man over the other. It's just simply that is his will, and his will should not be questioned. And then, of course, we've got Helena and Demetrius. They used to be a couple, but they no longer are. So the question is, does Demetrius still owe his affection to Helena because he once pledged his love to her? There's no easy answer to that. And the idea of Helena continuing to pursue Demetrius despite the fact that he's no longer interested is illustrative of unrequited love. And then, of course, we are going to be introduced to the fairy world, and the fairy world is going to introduce us to a coupling that also has their own love problems. We've got the king and queen, but this time of the fairies, not king and queen of humans, Oberon and Titania. Their love conflict is that they're arguing over a changeling boy. We're given some backstory here that basically this was the child of one of Queen Titania's servants who died in childbirth, and Titania feels this need to raise the child, and Oberon wants the child. Oberon doesn't give any real good justification as to why he wants the child, but he wouldn't need to, because in a marriage, the husband's will should be obeyed by the wife. He demands the child. She dares to say no. Even more so troubling, she has forsworn his marriage bed, which means that they are no longer having relations with one another. So he's quite upset. And they can represent, let's say, a married couple. And it doesn't matter whether you're human or fairy. It doesn't matter if you're married, engaged, or dating. All of these couples have love conflicts. And the play begins in Athens, which is supposed to represent order and civilization. And the play will move into the woods, which is supposed to represent that which is wild and untamed. We've seen this with other pieces of literature as well. So Shakespeare needs to get everybody into the forest, which is where the fairies live. And Shakespeare needs to find a way to get the fairy world to interact with the human world. So this is where the plot unfolds, where ultimately, in frustration, Aegeus goes to the highest law of the land, and he asks King Theseus to please intervene and to make his daughter Hermia listen to her father's will. And Theseus basically gives Hermia a choice that if she doesn't listen to her father's will, then she's either going to go to a nunnery or she's going to face death. And she is given some time to think about it. This is necessary for plot progression so that ultimately we can have the unfolding of plot. But I think it also serves thematically as well, because ultimately Theseus has his own love difficulties. So perhaps he feels a little bit of camaraderie with somebody else experiencing love difficulties. And in an act of generosity, perhaps, has given them time to consider. Another way of thinking about it is that Theseus is a very wise politician, and politicians know it's best not to make any decision for as long as possible. So this buys Theseus a little bit of time in the hope that perhaps things might settle themselves out on their own, and he wouldn't necessarily have to intervene because he's in a lose-lose situation. Either Aegeus is going to be unhappy, or Hermia and Lysander are going to be unhappy. So, of course, what we end up happening in the second act, and this is in the notes below under the fourth section, is where Oberon, the king of the fairies, hatches this plot with his serving person, Puck. Puck's a very interesting character because Puck is supposed to be a servant, but in many ways, Puck is much like a master, controlling and manipulating action. And Puck will often act on his own. And in fact, you should know that Shakespeare uses fairy folklore in this play, but changes it to suit his purposes. So there is in fairy folklore a Puck, a mischievous spirit, somebody who likes to play pranks, but not somebody who's evil. And in fairy folklore, there is indeed something called a changeling child, but it wouldn't be the way that it's presented in Shakespeare's play. A changeling child in fairy folklore would just be a human baby that would be stolen in the middle of the night by fairies and replaced with a fairy entity. So again, Shakespeare uses pagan references, he will use folklore, and he will use historical references as well, but adapt them to suit his own purposes. So what we find out too is that sometimes the conventions of a Shakespearean production might seem somewhat artificial. So, for instance, in the second act, at one point, Oberon says, "I'm invisible." This is for us as audience so that we know that as a fairy, he is invisible. So when the other characters are on stage, the humans, that is, they can't see him. It's even thought that during the time of the Renaissance, he might have been wearing a particular kind of costume to denote invisibility. Now, at this point, Demetrius tells Helena basically to stop following him. "If you follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the wood." By mischief, he means take her virginity. And because they have opportunity, and again, it's midsummer, and it's an incredibly charged moment in the pagan calendar, or day in the pagan calendar, and it's nighttime. And the difference between what happens during the daytime and the nighttime is also symbolically significant, that the night is when magic occurs, chaos occurs, sexuality occurs. And what Helena says in response, I think, is quite telling. She says, "Your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed. We're not made to woo." Helena's a complicated character because at one point, she says, "Treat me like your dog." And she's very passive, and she is, in many respects, like a stalker. That said, she made a good point that at the time, that this play takes place, and perhaps even today you can decide for yourself that a woman should not take the active role of pursuer. And Helena does that, so she defies stereotypes in that respect. And by the ending of the play, she gets what she wants. So Hermia and Helena basically defy some of the female stereotypes of the time and are successful. That doesn't mean that's going to happen with every character, because we know that Queen Titania is indeed going to lose that changeling boy. She will be humiliated, and that is going to be the resolution to the play. The assumption is that she's going to forgive Fairy Oberon for humiliating her. Just like the assumption is at the ending of the play that Helena and Hermia can forgive each other, even though they were hurling insults at one another, and that Helena and Hermia can forgive Lysander and Demetrius, who just treat them awfully over the course of the play. Granted, they're under the manipulation of love juice, but never forget I had a professor in college who basically said that both Lysander and Demetrius are jerks. It's just a question of who is the bigger jerk. We could even say the same with Oberon, because his grand plan is to ask Puck to take the love juice and to put in Queen Titania's eyes, and so that the first thing she sees, she falls in love with. Another message about love is that when we are in love, we no longer are interested in the things that used to hold our attention, like changeling boys. And ultimately, he's correct, because he is able to take the changeling. And it just so happens that Titania awakes and sees who? Bottom, the ass, who has been literally transformed into an ass by Puck, because Puck is mischievous. He figures, well, why not? And now they're having a relationship. Depends on the production you're seeing. In some productions, it seems pretty clear that they consummate that relationship. But whether they do or they don't, of course, the sexual punning about the ass being the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom would have been on the radar of audience members when they were watching the play, and that's part of the humor of the play. Of course, we know that when people are in love, they oftentimes do irrational things. Evidenced so well when Hermia decides to tell her best friend Helena that she is going to run away with her love Demetrius rather than have to face a nunnery or death. And they're going to run into the woods and find one of his family members who lives in another community. And Helena, in her convoluted thinking, believes that if she shares this information with Demetrius, he will be so indebted to her that ultimately his affections will turn to her. And of course, that's not what happens. Demetrius decides to go into the forest, the wilderness, that which is wild and untamed, and run after Hermia and get his love. And that means that Helena has to chase Demetrius. And of course, what this means is that we've got all four nobles in the forest. And of course, we've got the fairies in the forest anyway. So this is how we get all of the interactions. We're told that Bottom and his cohorts, who are representing a play within a play, and they're laborers, they're at the bottom of the social scale. They are going to rehearse in the woods because they're less likely to be disturbed there than in the city. So that gets them into the woods as well. So most of our major characters are in the woods at this point, which is where all of the magical machinations occur. One of the interesting pieces of dialogue in that second act is when Hermia says to Lysander, as they're running off and it's getting late and they're getting tired, they're going to sleep, and he wants to sleep next to her, and she says, no, for love and courtesy lie further off, and human modesty. Again, the idea that she wants to protect her virginity until marriage, which is what would have been the expectation of the time period. And when we get to Act 3, we know we're going to get the height of conflict and tension, and that's exactly what we experience. Bottom of all the characters is the one who says, whether he realizes it or not, reason and love keep little company nowadays. He has a level of insight the other characters don't. He is not married. Now, I understand that in the video version that we saw from Hoffman of A Midsummer Night's Dream. They married off bottom. I wish they hadn't have done that, because really that is not accurate to the text. I mean, that video version took a lot of liberties, obviously, as adaptations oftentimes do. And I'm not necessarily averse to the idea that they decided to set it in the 1800s rather than the 1500s, because ultimately I think general audience members would know or be understanding of the idea that the 1800s was a highly repressed time period. So at knowing at least that might help the audience understand some of the tension and conflict associated with sexuality. And I guess I'm not even averse to the idea of bicycles being ridden in that Hoffman version. They're beautiful, just like the fact that they decide not to set it in Athens, but to set it in Italy. And the film is on location, so it's quite lovely in many respects. But it's the bottom marriage that I think truly is unnecessary, because the fact that he's not married, I think, is important in terms of his being able to have insight, despite the fact that, well, he's an idiot. He's an ass. He has insight that many of the other characters are unable to have. Puck also has insight, and Puck, is not involved in a love relationship when he says, "What fools these mortals be." But I would suggest that it's not just the mortals who are fools, even the fairies, as we see with Oberon and Titania. And of course, what ends up happening is that Puck follows instructions, because he's told by Fairy Oberon to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. And the rationale for this is that Oberon feels a certain level of sympathy and pity as he eavesdrops and sees Helena fawn over Lysander. And the man wearing the Athenian garb could be misinterpreted, and this is where you can have a lot of fun playing the character of Puck, because you can act like an innocent as an actor, and that you were just following orders and you made a legitimate mistake and you put the love juice on the wrong man's eyes, putting them on Demetrius's eyes instead of Lysander's. Or you could say that Puck did this deliberately. He knew what he was supposed to do, but he decided to amuse himself and basically made this error, with the justification being that he was following orders, the man wearing the Athenian garb. So, of course, Helena, when now she has Lysander in love with her, rather than with her best friend, she's shocked, horrified, and assuming that they're basically playing cruel jokes on her. And of course, what ends up happening is that King Oberon is, Fairy Oberon is angered and demands that the love juice be put on the correct man's eyes, and which is done. But now we have two men under the influence of love juice who are in love with Helena, because the mistake was never undone. So this is the exact opposite of the beginning of the play, where we had two men in love with Hermia. Now we have two men in love with Helena. Helena is assuming that it's just a cruel joke. Hermia is assuming that Helena has stolen her man. And this is what I fondly call the catfight scene in Act 3. This would be the tip of the pinnacle of that pyramid, where both women are hurling insults at one another. It's going to show how easily friendships can be destroyed because of love relationships. And some of the insults may not sound like insults, but when you've got a Helena basically calling Hermia, "you puppet." A puppet is something that's small, so this is in reference to Hermia's short stature. And a puppet is also controlled by outside force. And another insult, this time from Hermia to Helena, "you painted maypole." And remember that the maypole was considered to be a phallic symbol, so she basically has just called her best friend a phallus, or her former best friend, I should say. And painted is in reference to makeup, that she's painted herself up to deceive others. That is something that a whore strumpet would do. and how quickly love can turn to hate, where you've got some terrible lines. Lysander at one point says, "Away, you Ethiop." This is supposed to be in reference to Hermia's dark features, not necessarily skin, but eyes and hair. And then Lysander continues and says, "Should I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead?" His first go-to is, "Perhaps I should kill Hermia, but I guess I won't." Remember, he used to love her just previously. And he continues by saying, "Get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bead, you acorn," all in reference to her short stature. So if this play were a tragedy, this is where the lovers would basically kill one another. But this play is a comedy, so we know that that can't be the case. Titania has awoken and fallen in love with Bottom the ass, who is a literal and figurative ass. Oberon has stolen the changeling child. Bottom is going to take advantage of this wonderful situation of having this incredible fairy queen in love with him. And we know that ultimately Puck is going to have to set things right if we're going to have a happy ending. That means Puck needs to remove the love juice from the wrong man's eyes, which he does. So he removes the love juice from Lysander so that Hermia and Lysander can once again be in love with one another. However, they leave the love juice in Demetrius's eyes so that Helena and Demetrius can be in love with one another. This is supposed to be a happy ending, but of course, it's complex, as Shakespeare oftentimes is. I don't know how I would feel if I were Demetrius, knowing that I was in love with someone merely because I was being manipulated. Even if I had previously loved them before being manipulated, but I had changed my mind, which gets to the question of how much obligation do we have to somebody when we pledge our love to them. And of course, both Helena and Hermia are going to have to ignore all of the horrors that occurred in the forest and basically forgive and forget each other and their respective mates, which they do for our, quote, happy ending, unquote, because that's necessary. And we know that Bottom is going to have to be transformed back into a human, and that ultimately Queen Titania is going to have to realize that she was with, at one point, an ass, which gets to the question of how many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass. That's a rhetorical question, by the way. And the idea is that love is blind and that none of us see the reality until after the fact of who our lover is. And one of the reasons why Helena and Hermia have such similar names is because they're easy to mix up with one another. The idea is that love is very fickle. One is just as good as another. And Lysander and Demetrius, while they might have different names, they have very similar personalities, oftentimes cast in roles where they have similar appearances. Again, that one lover can easily be exchanged for another, even though we maintain that our lover is unique and irreplaceable. Shakespeare's saying that that's not the case at all. So, Bottom comes up with perhaps the biggest moral of the play. Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, "Man is but an ass." Of course, that's humorous because Bottom was literally an ass and certainly is still figuratively an ass. The resolution? Ultimately, King Theseus decides that since the four lovers, the four nobles, are content with one another, they should just remain with one another. And basically, he overbears Aegeus's will, which again is a pretty dramatic statement, subversive even, about the idea of female getting her way. But also, it's probably the best of all possible worlds that Theseus could rule in this way, because if he ruled in any other way, there would be more individuals who are unhappy. At least all the lovers are content with one another. So it seems like this is the way that he can be, let's say, the most politically savvy in terms of not alienating too many individuals. And then it would seem that the play could end, and it doesn't. What we get is a play within a play, very Shakespearean. Shakespeare can oftentimes be very meta. Lots of things going on in Act 5 with that play within a play. Prior to that, King Theseus and Queen Titania are speaking to one another in what seems like a very innocent piece of dialogue when they're talking about how sometimes individuals don't give them the proper greetings because they're too nervous, and that they see that as basically a sign of honor, not disrespect. In other words, where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale, in conclusion dumbly broken off. Yet I picked a welcome. In Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 to 100. That's usually read as a tribute to Queen Elizabeth, who is probably in the audience at one point, being a great patron of the arts, that when she heard that speech, she thought of herself, that she too had that kind of grace, that when individuals would not necessarily greet her in an appropriate manner, it wasn't because they were being disrespectful. It was merely because they were nervous because of her greatness, and she saw that as a compliment as well. Never a bad idea to flatter, let's say, the queen or the king, or whomever happens to be watching the play. But at this point, it would have been the queen, because Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen, in that she never married, and that meant that she didn't have heirs, and eventually that meant that she would die, and someone would need to take over the throne, and it wasn't clear who it would be. Ended up being a distant relation of hers, King James, and this happened during Shakespeare's time, and King James would have seen some of Shakespeare's plays after Elizabeth had passed on. King James, not necessarily being the strongest supporter of the arts, not that he was averse to plays, but he thought that they were oftentimes too long-winded and rather dull. So the idea that Shakespeare's first play, when King James is in power, is Shakespeare's shortest play, Macbeth, seems to make a lot of sense, in that Shakespeare was likely catering to King James's taste, and that Macbeth is about the supernatural, which was also an interest of King James, and that Macbeth is about a Scottish king, which was King James's lineage. So again, Shakespeare being very clever as a business person and being very political, understood the importance of appealing to your audience, especially when your audience member was a king or a queen and had a great amount of power. But nevertheless, lots of things going on with the Pyramus and Thisbe play within a play. This is also a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to mock his competition, to show poor acting and poor writing, which is what we see in Pyramus and Thisbe, where these actors basically think that every part has to be played and everything needs to be explained to the audience. So someone needs to play Wall and explain that they are representing Wall, and somebody needs to play Lion and explain that they really aren't a real danger. So this is a way to critique Shakespeare's competition. He's basically, Pyramus and Thisbe is saying that this is the kind of work that Shakespeare's competition would be putting out. And this is a way also to critique audiences who wouldn't necessarily be watching Shakespeare's works, but be watching the works of his competition. It's also great humor. You know, there's a lot of physical humor here with Pyramus and Thisbe, which reads a lot like Romeo and Juliet. And it was thought that Romeo and Juliet was written around the same time. Again, we're not exactly sure when these plays were written, but the thinking is that Romeo and Juliet would have occurred either just immediately before or after Midsummer. And that said, it's also brilliant from a marketing perspective, because if Romeo and Juliet had just been produced, then audience members would have recognized the similarities between Pyramus and Thisbe and Romeo and Juliet, and they could very clearly see that Romeo and Juliet is superior to Pyramus and Thisbe. Or the other way around, that if the audience sees Pyramus and Thisbe first, and then after the fact they go to see a play like Romeo and Juliet, the idea is that they know what a tragic, what is supposed to be a tragic play how ridiculous it could be, as we see acted out in Pyramus and Thisbe. But that isn't Shakespeare, because we know that with A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's a great superior play to Pyramus and Thisbe, so one can expect that level of superiority in something like Romeo and Juliet that might perhaps get Shakespeare some audience members. Regardless, either way, it was masterful in terms of marketing and in terms of selling tickets. So that's another reason for Pyramus and Thisbe. Plus the idea that the lovers are watching this play and laughing, and because it's so absurd and ridiculous, but never once do they stop to consider that they themselves were equally absurd when they were in the forest. And the real lesson is for us as reader or as audience, because if we're laughing and we don't stop to consider that in our real lives we were equally absurd when it came to love, then Shakespeare's saying we've learned little or nothing. So you can see the multiple layers here. It also is so when Hippolytus says, for instance, this is the silliest stuff that ever I heard, if that's what you're thinking as well, what Shakespeare is saying is you don't understand, you are acting this silly and worse because it's real life for you. All of this is just a play. And of course, we know that Shakespeare will take an opportunity to make some sort of a sexual reference if possible. So when you've got Pyramus and Thisbe at one point says, my cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee. That's usually read as a reference to oral sex, where there are references to moaning as well. Stones being references to testicles, and lime and hair being references to pubic hair. So by the time all of this happens, there's a good possibility that just about everybody in the audience is offended for a whole range of reasons, either because we've just been called asses or because we ourselves have had love difficulties and we see ourselves mirrored in these characters, or because, let's say, the sexual punning went a little bit too far. So having the play end with an apology is not a bad idea, but in true Shakespearean fashion, it will be a complex apology. This is put in the mouth of Puck, and Puck is oftentimes seen as a Shakespearean character, mischievous, controlling, and manipulating action. And Puck is basically saying, if we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here. It might be perhaps one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. And basically, it's the character of Puck apologizing. It's the actor in the character of Puck apologizing. It's Shakespeare in the actor in the character apologizing. But it is a backhanded apology. First, Puck says, if we've offended, think that this was just a dream. It's not real. This is just a play. And that ultimately, if I am an honest Puck and we have unearned luck, the thing is, Puck is not honest. So everything he just has said has been negated when he reminds us that he's not an honest Puck. So if he's apologizing, maybe he's not apologizing. And he says, too, or else Puck the liar call. But Puck is indeed a liar. So not only does he say that he's sorry, and again, we have to question, are you really sorry? He also asks for applause. If we be friends, give me your hands, which means applause. And he wants to escape the serpent's tongue, which is hissing and booing in an audience, which, of course, audiences would have been very vocal about if they disliked something. And he says, good night unto you all, which is basically the way of saying the play's over. The show is done. And he says, Robin shall restore amends if necessary. But again, Puck's a liar, so is that really true? That Puck is trying to restore amends, or that Puck is even sorry for having perhaps offended us? So those are some of the things that I wanted to point out in terms of the play. And I thought what I would do is give you an opportunity just to go through the play. And I've identified some quotes, but this play is filled with quotes that are important. So that would be today's attendance question. That would be due on Friday the 14th. And certainly if you need an extension, let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn. I've gotten a little bit behind with answering the discussion forum responses because I want to finish up with grading your first paper. So I'm in the midst of that right now, but I will finish that up soon and then get back to the discussion forums. But this question is about quotation in Midsummer Night's Dream. For you to identify an important quote in Midsummer Night's Dream and talk a little bit about why you think it might be important. I've identified some. You might highlight some of those, or perhaps you might want to come up with your own quote. And then we can finish up with talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream and begin our very last drama, which happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. And you can see that in our notes below, in the very last section, I have a link to A Raisin in the Sun, which is the same link for the text that I had ordered for class. And once again, we will see a performance. And one of the things that's unique about this performance is that the playwright herself, Lorraine Hansberry, worked on the screenplay, as opposed to what we saw with, obviously, in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare didn't work on the screenplay. So we see simplified language, which I think makes sense if you're going to make a Hollywood production and adapt it to a Hollywood audience who may not necessarily have seen the play. And using A-list actors is always a good choice, I suppose, if you want to sell tickets in a typical Hollywood production. And certainly, the idea of simplifying the language, and obviously the version that we saw and all versions that you can probably see of Midsummer Night's Dream will take some liberties. That's the case of just about any performance. But I'm hopeful that after seeing performance and after talking a little bit about the play, might make a bit more sense to you. But again, we're not necessarily done with the play because I'd like you to consider an important quote and why you think it's important. But I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to stop here. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class, segueing from A Midsummer Night's Dream to A Raisin in the Sun. Take care. Bye-bye.